had two successful.
A historic meeting is taking place on the Caribbean island of Barbados. Delegates from the African Union, Europe, the Americas, and the Caribbean are discussing reparations for the descendants of victims of the transatlantic slave trade. Barbados' ambassador to the Caribbean community, or CARICOM, says the summit itself is indicative of the momentum the international reparations movement has gained in recent years.
We see reparations in terms of the right to development. The way we see reparations is, look, European countries develop themselves at the expense of the systematic underdevelopment of countries like Barbados and the Caribbean territories and the continent of Africa. And reparations is about acknowledging the criminality that underlay that and now taking concrete measures to help repair some of the damage that was done.
Just a few miles away from where diplomats and human rights advocates are looking to the future, the history and legacy of slavery is more present. This is Newton Plantation, one of the oldest sugarcane plantations on Barbados. It's also the final resting place for hundreds of enslaved persons.
All of this would be a sea of greenery.
How many enslaved people would have been working?
About 200, which is quite a lot. One enslaved person to acre and a half.
All of it enforced by the whip.
By the whip, yes. The whip and sometimes the gun.
Historians like Trevor Marshall say Barbados, like other former slave societies, never recovered from the centuries of oppression, adding that the road to making things right begins with reparations.
Over the span of hundreds of years, some 500,000 people were enslaved in Barbados. Now, nearly 2 centuries after emancipation, this small Caribbean nation has become a leading voice for slavery reparations.
The delegates meeting in Barbados this week are expected to devise an international framework for advocacy at an international level, building off a 10-point plan for reparatory justice. This includes things like debt cancellation, development projects, and formal apologies from European governments, who activists say continue to reap the fruits of slave labor.
Well, Manuel joins us now from Bridgetown in Barbados. Manuel, it's always one thing to call for reparations, as we heard in your report. It's a difficult job to actually get them. So what's sort of the timeline or the plan by the organisers of this summit?
Good to be with you. So we're in Bridgetown, Barbados. We're on the campus of the West Indies University. The day of the summit today is already starting to wrap up. The conclusion of this historic, unprecedented summit is on Thursday, the 27th. But like you said, it's one thing to talk about reparations. It's a completely different thing to talk about how it's going to be implemented. And that is really the central theme of this meeting taking place here in Barbados today. This has gone from a topic that was once considered fringe to now becoming a global movement. And if we can talk about one aspect of this reparations movement that's gained the most traction, it's this idea of building a unified framework for how to proceed in terms of global advocacy, in terms of a global legal framework that can be presented before an international community, specifically before international courts like the International Court of Justice. What we're seeing are members of representatives from the African Union, representatives from Caribbean countries, from CARICOM, as well as representatives from civil society groups from the Americas, from the United States, from Europe, all coming together to create something that hasn't been created before, which is a unified approach to the idea of reparations. That's something that these folks together can come together and demand reparations from countries like Spain, the UK, Belgium, the Netherlands, among others. And when it comes to reparations, this is a term that doesn't have a one single definition. This is something that may not even have the same approach across the board. This isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. But reparations in a country like Barbados, for example, where a country that is predominantly made up of descendants of Africans. It could take the form of a development plan. It could take the form of debt forgiveness, something very different to the conversation over reparations in countries like the United States, where black Americans represent a statistical minority. Regardless of the fact, what we are seeing as being emblematic of this summit that's taking place right now is that this is indicative of a very ripe moment in history. What we're hearing overwhelmingly from historians, from advocates for human rights, is that now is the time. It is long overdue for reparations.
And indeed, I mean, you know, you just touched on the fact that there are countries in Africa as well as South America, the Caribbean, all talking about reparations. It means different things to different countries. And even President Macron, who's apologised in his own way to Africa in 2021 at the Africa-France summit, said that reparations must be repaid in a sustainable manner. And that's quite sort of poignant at a time when the world is dealing with climate change, inflation, a cost of living crisis. It's where is this money, if it's money that countries want, going to come from?
That's absolutely right, Sahel. And the topic of apologies has certainly been a central theme here. We've heard apologies, this sort of wave of apologies going on around the world from former colonizing nations, from former nations that were involved in the transatlantic slave trade. And what we hear from diplomats, from human rights advocates here at this summit, is that these apologies seem to always fall short. They're not exactly doing what they need to do to make things right. And that's where reparations come into place. But to answer your question about why Barbados, this is a question that we asked ourselves before arriving in the country ahead of this summit, and it all has to do with the nation's history. In 1627, when Barbados was established as a colony of Great Britain, there was a system that was established with it, a system of governance, a system of ideology that was centered exclusively around this idea of slavery. And that's a history that's not lost on the average person of this island. So when you take that into context, when you take the legacy of slavery into account, that's very much present in the minds and hearts of the people of Barbados, it's easy to understand how a country that was once such an important colony for the British has emerged as a leading voice for a movement for reparations that's now taking on a global scale.
Manuel, thanks very much for the update from Bridgetown. Manuel Rapallo for us there in Barbados.